Gaffney joins me, Executive Chairman of the Center for Security Policy and Vice Chair of the Committee on the Present Danger. SecureFreedom.org, CounterJihad.com, and PresentDangerChina.org. Frank, you do a good job keeping an eye on the panda huggers within powerful positions in the government. I think you'd like to bring a new one to our attention this morning, is what I'm told.
That's true, Alex. I'm very concerned about the idea that a man who has been the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission for the past several years, named Jay Clayton, is being actively considered for, I guess it's a promotion, to become the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. And why that's important, Alex, is that job as U.S. Attorney is arguably the top position in the Justice Department with responsibility for the enforcement of America's securities laws. Because, of course, in its jurisdiction is Wall Street, and typically the U.S. Attorney's Office is sort of the watchdog and the enforcer with respect to not only that securities market, but the others there as well. And what's so troubling is, as we document in a powerful letter signed out by the chairman of our Committee on the Present Danger China, Brian Kennedy, on Monday, is 7 different instances or examples of the kind of conduct Jay Clayton has engaged in as the SEC chairman that have enabled the Chinese Communist Party and various companies that are associated with it to tap to the tune of perhaps as much as $3 trillion our capital markets to help underwrite dangerous activities that the CCP, as it's called, has been engaged in now for decades. Unrestricted warfare against us, in other words. So this would seem to be a disqualifier for a guy who would next be charged with trying to make sure that the Chinese conform to our securities laws. He hasn't done it in his present job. It's unlikely he would do it in the next. And the stakes could hardly be higher, Alex. As you know, we talk about it every single week, basically. These guys, the Chinese Communist Party, and those that are working with and for it, which frankly includes people who are in our streets at the moment engaged in revolution against us here, are sworn enemies. It's madness to be underwriting their activities, which is precisely what we've been doing now. And it must come to an end. Promoting a guy who has been promoting that practice would seem to me to be very ill-advised. I don't think it's going to happen, by the way. Chuck Schumer and the other senator from New York, Kristen Gillibrand, and Lindsey Graham, who would oversee this confirmation process were he to be, in fact, formally nominated to take on that U.S. Attorney's role, have all indicated they don't think it's going to happen. It shouldn't happen, so it probably won't. But still, he's in the job as the SEC chairman. That's bad enough.
Frank, by the way, I'm having a little trouble getting a clear reception. I think we got all that we needed to out of that. I just want to make sure that you're doing your best to get to a good spot where we can all chat. So tell me about how this could potentially help China if this move is made.
Well, Alex, the basic proposition is that if you are a friend of China, if you are considered to be a reliable ally of China, if you are someone who is, well, they have a rather colorful term for it, a running dog of China, you are playing for the other team, fundamentally. And really, I think this is kind of the threshold question. Do we understand that the Chinese Communist Party is our enemy? If you do, a lot of things flow from that. You obviously are going to try to make sure you don't continue to have supply chains that are dependent upon them. You obviously are going to try to resist rather than enable its global ambitions, the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, this colonial enterprise. You're going to regard the military buildup it's engaging in as a threat to our country, which of course it is, rather than thinking that you can blithely continue to encourage American investors to put more and more and more money into the enterprises that are bringing us those very problems. And by the way, just last week, Alex, there was a campaign mounted by MSCI, which is the company that runs the largest of the indexes that have put more and more and more Chinese companies into their portfolios, to go get more American investors to buy what are called A shares of China that are completely regulated, that are fraught with problems like fraud and material risks and, harm to our national security and human rights values. I mean, these are the sorts of things that nobody in their right mind in America should be promoting. And yet that is essentially big business for Wall Street, and they are pursuing it relentlessly, even as President Trump has said, quite rightly, this isn't a good idea. We shouldn't allow, especially China, to be playing by preferential rules that our companies don't get in terms of accountability and transparency and so on. So, really, it just comes down to this. If you think about the Cold War with the Soviet Union, would we really recommend putting money into the USSR to enable it to threaten us? Would we really recommend putting money into Hitler's Third Reich to threaten us? These are the sorts of things that were regarded quite sensibly as ill-advised. Some people did them, by the way. Henry Ford notably helped the Germans in the run-up to World War II quite significantly. But it was recognized as a mistake. It is an even bigger mistake today. Jay Clayton doesn't get that. He's supposed to testify on Thursday, tomorrow, before the House Financial Services Committee, and I hope very much that he will be taken to task on what he's doing in this regard. It's really, I believe, malfeasant.
Interesting. Frank Gaffney, Center for Security Policy. A few other headlines I want to get to in topics. Let's talk about what's happening between India and China, where India has now changed the rules of engagement to allow soldiers to shoot Chinese invaders. We reported on some of these pretty horrific and somewhat barbaric brawling at the really hazy border between India and China that involved bludgeons and makeshift weapons and I think hurling people off cliffs. And it was this very sort of third world, ancient times style fighting. Well, now India is changing that, saying that they can shoot at Chinese soldiers if they invade. And that is interesting. But also it's interesting that we're seeing widespread boycotts of China from India. It seems like they're really standing up to China in a way that is potentially a good sign geopolitically, but I'm sure you've given this some thought. What are you thinking?
Well, first of all, what's China doing? It is acting aggressively against India. At the same time, by the way, it is acting aggressively against a number of other nations, particularly in the Pacific region. I think it's feeling its oats. I think it's sensing that we are distracted by the coronavirus that it unleashed on us and all that has flowed from it, for example, that there's an opportunity for them to begin to become more aggressive, to become more assertive, and to be more dominant. This is really the agenda of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, what the Indians have done, and I think they deserve our credit and our support, is they're exercising a little bit of peace through strength, as Ronald Reagan used to call it, Alex. They're putting the Chinese on notice that they will have their troops maintaining, as you say, this somewhat fuzzy so-called line of actual control, the border there, with orders to shoot and the means to do it in the event that these aggressive activities of the Chinese continue. And you're right. I mean, what they were doing in the absence of those orders and capabilities was almost, primeval, with considerable loss of life, and that shouldn't be continuing, because it does indeed have the potential to escalate much further, and should not, as I say, be something that we countenance, let alone turn a blind eye to.
Okay, so where do you think this goes, and do you think that anyone else around the world gets involved, and does it have lasting implications for, places like America, et cetera?
What the Chinese typically do is they revert to encouraging their Pakistani proxies to mix things up with the Indians. This is, sort of their standard playbook technique, rather than do it themselves. Again, what's somewhat striking about this, they've of course invaded before, and they've had sort of small-scale conflicts with the Indians before directly. But my guess is that they'll try to sort of tamp things down for the moment, but they'll light things up with the Indians and the Pakistanis, and that's fraught. That is seriously fraught, because, of course, you have two nuclear powers that have engaged in a series of wars in the past. But it's evidence of really, I think, the malevolence and the sense that the Chinese have at the moment that they can get away with, murder.
All right. So one thing that I want to stress, which is, I think we'll dovetail into a little bigger conversation. So the EU is apparently going to ban Americans over the coronavirus, but they're not going to ban the Chinese. And we know that the Chinese out of Beijing, for example, are canceling quadruple-digit number of flights, and we have no sense of what's up or down, certainly based off of we have every indication that the virus is getting worse in China at this point. In the United States, there's a lot of hype numbers that are going around. The death rate is at the lowest it's been in several months, and yet we're getting a lot of positive test results, which people I think are pretty wildly blowing out of proportion in the media, who like to keep the shut down for as long as humanly possible. I'm not saying that there aren't probably 2 or 3 areas in the country that might be seeing a little bit of a resurgence, but there's all of this hype because we have such widespread testing, Frank. And when people go into a hospital, they're usually getting tests at this point, and so they might test positive, but they're not symptomatic, or they're not going to really suffer from the coronavirus, COVID-19, but they are a positive test result, and thus go into the very scary data. And so there's all this happening in the United States. Europe shuts travel down from the United States, but not China. And why is this? Because the United States, by and large, doesn't penalize people who are not kind to us, and China really does. That's my take. What's your take?
Yeah, this certainly seems like it's a political thing rather than a public health issue, Alex, to me. It's not just China, which, as you say, is, of course, the wellspring of this disease and is continuing to have problems with it. It's Uganda. It's Vietnam. It's Cuba. These are all countries that you can bet have more problems with this particular epidemic than we do. And they may not be acknowledging it. They may not be documenting it. But it is, fatuous doesn't begin to describe it. It is malfeasant, again, to engage in this kind of restriction of Americans who they can have considerably higher confidence are being properly screened and monitored and tested and so on than people that they're letting in blithely. But to your point about China, the Chinese brought this virus to Europe in the first instance with devastating effect. Remember the death toll in Italy not so long ago. To turn a blind eye to that, to accommodate the Chinese, because the Europeans clearly are intent on doing business with China, is, I believe, putting the people of Europe at risk, and suggestive of the abiding hostility of the bureaucracy, as it's called, the European Union's bureaucrats and political leaders, for that matter, towards this country. And it's regrettable, but I think in the end of the day, it's probably going to, the way this is being played, this is going to actually be harmful to Europeans more than to Americans.
Really, that's so interesting, and it's a very interesting sign of you should just call it like you see it. Just call it like you see it and stop playing these stupid games. And it just shows that this is level of ignorance, but also this in fear of China. That's the thing that I worry about, Frank, is that as much as people would like to think that the more virtuous side usually wins out, traditionally speaking, in many areas of life, be it domestic or international, that whoever might makes right in so many cases, or the golden rule. Whoever has the gold makes the rules, and that's what we're seeing in the United States as well with this intimidation and cancel culture, which is already having a huge effect. Seeing our monuments come down, seeing our cities burned out. A lot of this has to do with the willpower. It has to do with not what is logical, not what is legal even, not what is moral, certainly. It's about who's got the willpower. And left has a lot of willpower. China has a lot of willpower. And we're not being taught willpower at this point. And we're not being taught that that should be a factor. We're being taught that basically we're supposed to virtue signal to the woke crowd, and that's the whole point of life. And this is, I know it's a kind of a broader concept, but I think it's probably resonant in this context.
It's very important, Alex. And again, what I'm concerned about is a lot of what is going on in this country at the moment, in the terms of the left doesn't really begin to describe it, the Marxists that are running Antifa and that are, frankly, deeply embedded in Black Lives Matter, for that matter. I'm not suggesting everybody who supports it is, but I'm saying that the leadership declared themselves just the other day to be Marxist and very steeped in the doctrine of, communism. What does that mean? Well, it means that you engage, as you say, in bullying. Do you remember this, Alex? It wasn't so long ago that bullying was one of those things that was abhorrent to the left. We were all told that we mustn't allow it, whether it's, sexual bullying or whether it's bullying in playgrounds or gender bullying or other. Well, bullying is what is now being not only tolerated, but actually endorsed by political figures in this country, by, people in the streets with taking knees, by the media, heavens knows, and others. And what that translates into inevitably, just as it does on the school playground, whether it's states, whether it's parties, whether it's movements, you indulge it, you don't resist it, you succumb to it, submit to it, you get more of it. And the kind of bullying that we're talking about now is going to determine the future of our republic. Make no mistake about it. And so that's very worrying, because taking down our republic is a top priority for the Chinese Communist Party. It happens to be a top priority for those in the streets at the moment, at least the leaders of the movements that are driving the forces in the streets at the moment, tearing down statues and despoiling our capitals and the like. This is not to be tolerated. It has to be resisted. It has to be resisted at the rhetorical level, and it has to be resisted by law enforcement. And the law enforcement has to know that we have their back, because they're putting it on the line for the rule of law and for us. And if the alternative is bullying, doesn't really begin to describe it. It is revolution, and it will take us out if we tolerate it.
Frank, speaking of, I can't believe this, because this is the last topic I want to bring up with you, and I had forgotten this was in my rundown, and it just fits so perfectly. The UN tweeted the following: UN #human rights experts expressed profound concern over a recent statement by the U.S. Attorney General describing Antifa and other anti-fascist activists as domestic terrorists, saying it undermines the rights to freedom of expression and a peaceful assembly in the country. So the UN is lecturing our Attorney General in the United States of America, that Antifa is actually peaceful. Frank, this has been deleted, which is actually a good sign. I can't believe that it was deleted, but that is a I'll tell you, when the UN went over to Breitbart, about 88,000 comments on the story. They probably didn't like it. But what I mean, this is we laugh, we don't cry.
Yeah. Well, look, thank you for bringing this up, and more to the point, thank you for calling attention to it on the page, Alex. This is such a teachable moment because not only is this outrageous that the UN's Geneva office is putting the Antifa flag on their Twitter feed and endorsing it as legitimate and peaceful expression and protected under our laws. This is written by a woman who is on the board of directors of a Soros organization called the Open Society Foundation's Women Program, which tells you everything you need to know about the degree to which the UN is being run by hard leftists, by Marxists, by communists, by their, well, as I say, running dogs and supporters. And to the extent that this is venomously hostile to the United States, that they would just as soon see us taken down. It's another aspect of the problem. It's the globalist piece of the red, green, and hard left communist axes against which we have to now operate. It's all the more important that the American people, and particularly the Breitbart audience, is clued up about the nature of the challenge that we're facing, its comprehensiveness, the synergies that it takes from the various elements of people who basically just have in common their antipathy to freedom. And for them to wrap themselves in the guise of being the people who are defending freedom by supporting Antifa, for heaven's sakes, is all you really need to know about the challenge that we're facing and the need for us to find in our own gut the resolve. You talked about that earlier, the resolve to resist and to defend freedom, to defend our country. This is it. Use it or lose it, folks.
Frank Gaffney, Center for Security Policy, securefreedom.org, counterjihad.com, presentdangerchina.org for the committee and the Present Danger China. Terrific conversation as always, Frank. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you. Bless you, Alex.